Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk about time compression or time skipping and time jumping in narrative and the different ways that film deals with it or television deals with it. Because within a book, it's actually really easy to do because you can just put in a time skip. Because when we are reading, we read the character name and that's what we're building the character out of. It's all in our imagination. But of course, with film and television, there's a physical person representing that role. And for the most part, actors have a range of ages that they can conceivably play. And we'll get into that. But I thought this was interesting because there's been a number of different television shows and films recently that have been trying to show this. And one of the reasons it comes up in fantasy quite a lot, particularly fantasy adaptation, of which we are living in a golden age, a lot of fantasy stories have epic scales, and quite a few of them happen over epic time frames. And when your characters are immortal, um, say for instance, like elves quite often are depicted as being immortal, or at least very long lived, then you can have a character play or an actor play the same character at all these various different time periods. But if you are mixing immortal characters or long lived characters with short lived characters, even in a story that is focusing primarily on the long lived characters, you would be constantly swapping in and out all of the shorter lived characters, like humans or hobbits or anything like that. So that can create audience confusion. So I want to talk a little bit about how a lot of these recent TV shows and films have, well, one of them isn't a recent film, have done this just to illustrate different ways that this is done. And the first is to take a very simple sequence. If we think of the film Highlander, in Highlander, it is the story of Connor MacLeod in, and for the sake of argument, I'm just going to say modern day New York, New York back in the 90s. But Connor MacLeod in the film is an immortal. And the filmmakers wanted to show Connor in different historical time periods to show that he is actually immortal because it's visually representing. It's not just Connor going, "Yes, I'm an immortal," and someone trying to kill him and going, "Oh, look, see, I'm fine." It's if they've lived an immortal life, it's a great way to show that to the audience. So if you think about it, there are two main ways that they could have done this. And obviously they went with one of them, and it's the one that I think it best suits what they were trying to do. But they could have told the plot and story as synonyms, as synonymous. And by that I mean plot is the sequence of events as we encounter them as the narratees, as the people being narrated to, as the viewers. The sequence of events as we encounter them. That is the plot. The story is taking all of those events and organizing them chronologically. So, in a sense, the sequence of events as the character experienced them. So, the difference with Highlander is they could have shown Connor MacLeod back in Scotland and the first time he dies. Sorry, bad sneezing fit. But they could have started in Scotland, showed the first time he died and him being resurrected, and then moving on to the next time period and keep jumping forward in time to each of the next sort of subsequent important events until eventually ending up in modern day New York. Now, if you think of the effect that that would create, that would be a very disjointed first part of the film because the whole first third of the film would be jumping time periods with nothing bridging them, nothing sort of putting them in context. It would just be this one person um, going from time period to time period. It'd be very difficult to construct that as an engaging narrative. What they did instead was they start in New York in the modern day setting, and then they have Connor remember, to reminisce about the past. And it's usually done with a screen wipe and sometimes a voiceover connection between them. But these are all framed as memories. So we have Connor established as a character in the modern day, and then we jump back in time for a memory. So we know that this is a memory. We know it is in the past, whereas the modern day setting of New York is being framed as the present. And we don't know what's going to happen next. But clearly, Connor does know what's going to happen next about the past. So within that, in terms of narrative, you could refer to these as flashbacks, analepsis, jumping back in time to show what happened. Now, that is a very simple sequence where there is one character and one story. The story that is actually happening, the narrative that is occurring, is set in a very short time space in New York City. And the rest of it is sort of not filler, but additional, because you could tell the story about immortal warriors fighting in New York over a several week period. That's the story of Highlander. All of those additional things give additional depth to the character of Connor, give additional depth and resonance to relationships he's had, friendships he's had. It fills in all of those things, but they're not necessary. So I spoke about this before and called, the difference between kernels and satellites. The kernels here are the things that happen in New York. They have to happen for the narrative that we are watching to make sense. But the flashback sequences are irrelevant to that. They add depth, but they are not necessary. You can remove those from the film and the film still makes sense. You can't remove many of the sequences in New York for the film to make sense. But moving on from this, we have it done in a slightly different way in The Serpent Queen. In The Serpent Queen, it's a series about Catherine de' Medici. The modern day, or the current day, or the present, is being framed at a certain point in French history, where Catherine is Queen Mother. And during this, she tells the story of her early life to a servant. And it is framed that way. And while she is talking to the servant, it then flashes back to the early point of her life. So a bit like Highlander, except these are not just memories. An added dimension is placed here because now we have a character narrating a story, not just remembering. And again, I realize that memory can be fickle, memory can be fallible, memory can be unreliable, but not to the extent that Catherine, as narrator, can manipulate the narrative. Catherine is an unreliable narrator because she is telling the story to a servant. She is telling a story to an audience. And she is clearly trying to manipulate things. So we don't know whether or not what Catherine is saying is the absolute truth of what happened. We still believe it. We still watch it. But we are aware that Catherine could be lying or exaggerating. But one of the important things about this is in Highlander, Christopher Lambert played both parts. The young Connor MacLeod, the current Connor MacLeod, because he was immortal. He didn't age. In this, we have two different actors playing Catherine de' Medici. We have Samantha Morton playing the modern day, or I keep saying modern day, the contemporary, the Catherine in the present of the French court, played by Samantha Morton. But for young Catherine, a number of those scenes are played by a much younger actor. And because of that, if there was no introduction to this, yes, we, the audience, would have eventually cottoned on. But what the writers and the filmmakers decided to do was they had Catherine frame it as a story about her life, introduce this character. There is a voiceover linking them. And therefore, this portrayal of young Catherine is authorized by the older version. And because of that, it is very specifically pointed out, yes, this is the same person. This is me at a younger age. And because of that, the audience is reassured. And even though they don't look alike, we're fine with it being the same person. We don't have any difficulty imagining that. But if we hadn't had that framing device of the narration and the fact that this is a story told by the older version of the character we're about to see, if it had just cut to that earlier sequence, until someone had said the name Catherine, we would have wondered, who the hell is this? Because no matter how good a likeness you can get between a young person and an older actor, that likeness isn't going to be perfect. And it can cause that disconnect. So the filmmakers chose to use both flashback and to have the voiceover to link them, and chose to use it in a form of frame narrative, that this older Catherine is speaking about her younger self. So those three things together make it easy for the audience to understand young Catherine and old Catherine. Now, the reason I say that this is slightly different in film and television than books, if you think of Mark Lawrence's Broken Empire trilogy, in that it's the story of Jorg or Jorg, depending on how you're going to pronounce it. But essentially, it's one long chronological sequence that is split in two, and we get half of both sequences, half of the sort of contemporary Jorg and half of the past Jorg in each book, until eventually it all meets up at the very, very end. So that is easy to convey. It's not a complicated trick. And one of the things that it does is it allows for an alternation between something that was exciting in the sort of the past to talk about, then jump to something exciting happening in the present. And then you can form lines and points of connection between the two stories to show how sins of the past can affect the current situation. And it's one of the reasons why authors like doing it that way. You don't need to tell a story chronologically. But when we think of something like The Witcher season one, it might seem that this is a radically different approach, because Witcher season one was criticized by a number of people for having a confusing sort of setup of the different timelines and the chronologies, and it was all a bit confusing. And yet, at the heart of it, we had Yennefer's storyline and chronology. We had Geralt's storyline and chronology, which was slightly later on in the world timeline. And then we had Ciri's timeline and chronology, which was slightly later on from Geralt's, and where we were sort of placing the present of the narrative. So if Ciri is in the present, and both Geralt and Yennefer are long lived, they can age to the point where they can interact with Ciri. So you can see that it was three separate sort of story threads, each focused on one person, the way that a normal chronological sequence is. And all they chose was to intercut them in much the same way that we would do with a lot of different properties. But the thing that we run into here is, unlike in a book, where if it suddenly shifted time period, there was usually like the date underneath the chapter heading or something like that that would suddenly give away that you're now in a different time period. They could have done that. They could have time-stamped every change of time period, but that is extra diegetic material, extra diegetic information outside of the diegesis. So if Geralt is walking into town and suddenly it appears on screen, Blaviken with a year, Geralt can't see that. That is something outside of the diegesis, outside of the story world. That is something that is being put there for the viewer. So including information like that, if you think about it, is reminding people that they are watching something rather than being immersed. It might only be a very small dint in immersion, but if you're trying to create something that is truly immersive, you don't want extra diegetic information. You want to try and keep it as diegetically clean as possible. So what they chose to do instead was, in a sequence in which a character had been established, say Yennefer's sequence, they could mention the upcoming battle that the Queen of Sintra was going to take part in. And therefore, we have an historical event that is in the future for Yennefer's character at that point. And when it switched scene to, say, Ciri's storyline, and we see the Queen of Sintra, and they are referring to the battle that happened many, many years ago, we suddenly realize Yennefer's storyline, the present of Yennefer's storyline, must be in the past of the present of Ciri's storyline. And the thing was, the writers were very, very careful to do this for these time switches at least once an episode. And it was actually incredibly clever. When the new sequence started up, when they changed to the new temporal location, there was usually something in that scene that let you know it was a different time period to the one that we had just watched. So that is another way of doing it. You can take what would be the chronology of the world line, start with Yennefer becoming a sorceress, then have a couple of episodes following her, then Geralt being mixed into it, and now you have a TV show that is the same time period with Yennefer doing one thing, Geralt doing another, and their paths occasionally crossing. And then you would end up with the last couple of episodes, including Ciri. And the thing is, you would have had time jumps all the way along between the sort of the boring bits, where Yennefer wasn't doing anything and Geralt wasn't doing anything. You would just skip forward in time to the next thing, and you would have a chronological sequence. But if you laid it out like that, you can see that that would be a very different narrative experience. And this brings me on to talk about House of the Dragon, because House of the Dragon was faced with this decision. They had a historical event or a historical sequence that they were adapting. But instead of having someone in the present or the current setting tell the story of what happened in the past, which is, you know, an artificial narrative device, what they chose to do was tell it chronologically. And when they got to a boring bit, they did a time jump, they did a time skip. They just excised that material and then moved on. And because of that, the human characters constantly have to be aging in between episodes. And so there are different actors playing different characters. Now, I said at the beginning that a human actor can play a range, and there are lots of different ways. You have practical effects and makeup to age a character or de-age a character. You have CGI and computer effects to age or de-age a character. Or you could do what Kevin Spacey did in the Bobby Darin biopic, where they just went to hell with it and had Kevin Spacey play Bobby Darin at all periods of the life, and you just went with it because it was kind of artificial. But when you're trying to create something immersive, when you're trying to create that feeling of reality, of an alternate reality, that is something that sort of sticks out if someone is the wrong age for the character, and it can break people's immersion. So you try to mitigate that. And so the showrunners and the writers and the team involved in House of the Dragon had young characters and younger actors playing them. And then when the characters aged, had older actors play them. But without the framing device of the older character sort of saying, yes, this is young me, they needed something else. And because it was being shown chronologically, we were going from a lot of the early sequences and then jumping forward to a later sequence. So I'd mentioned with Highlander, that would have been a problem because they're not connected. But here, the settings quite often and the general theme and thrust of the story is the point of connection. So what the showrunners did was, if you are paying careful attention to when you see a new actor brought in for a character because of them aging up, the scene in which you see them will be linked to a previous scene. There will be dialogue used specifically to highlight who that actor is now portraying. And quite often they will use costuming to very clearly indicate who the character is. And it's very common technique in film and television, particularly with series, to have characters always dress in, say, certain colors, and that makes them readily identifiable on screen. So you can have a character who always wears blue as a general color, and another character who always wears red as a general color. So you can have a lot of freedom with how much red is in their outfit and what outfits they're wearing. But as long as you keep to that scheme of always including red, it makes them easier to identify. And this is one of the techniques they use on House of the Dragon. They have characters, when the new actor is being introduced as that character, the scene will be constructed where costuming, setting, what they are discussing, and how they are addressed by others is all brought into play to confirm to the audience that this is the character. And again, it's a clever way to do it, but that's one of the weaknesses of not having someone go, yes, and this is young me, or this is older me. And you don't have that telling aspect. You have to show it. And this is one of the ways to show it. And that brings me on to the last one that I wanted to discuss, which was Rings of Power. And Rings of Power, a bit like House of the Dragon, was taking a long chronology. But one of the issues that they faced that House of the Dragon didn't is that you had very long-lived characters, immortal characters like the elves. And in comparison, you had humans whose lives, in comparison to elves, are kind of like mayflies. And because these events are stretched out over thousands of years, yes, you could have had the same actors play the elven characters all the way through. But for them to have any meaningful interaction with the world, they would have had to interact with other races, the humans and the dwarves. And the thing is, given the scale of what was going to be shown, you would have constantly had to change out all of the human actors and the human characters. So it wouldn't just be replacing an older actor for a younger actor for a character. That character would have ceased to exist. And so there would have been new characters constantly having to be introduced. And again, another bad sneeze. So the issue with this then becomes, if you're constantly cycling in and out characters, there's no opportunity to really get the audience to bond with them. Because even if that character, that human character, appeared one episode to the next, that would kind of be it for the season. So you're asking new characters to be introduced, build a relationship to the audience, and then just be removed, summarily removed, not even have a dramatic death or anything like that. It's just next episode. No, it's 200 years later and that character had died and this is now their great grandson. You can see why that wouldn't be a particularly compelling way to tell the story. So the way that Rings of Power approached this was, instead of doing time skips where you would constantly be cycling out these characters, the way that House of the Dragon used a time skip, they chose instead to compress the timeline, to remove those gaps in time and act as if a lot of these events were concurrent. And therefore, they can use the same characters in all the different episodes. And the immortal characters are still immortal characters. But now they can, instead of taking 1,000 years to do something, if they compress the time frame to say 100 years, certain characters will age out. Certain other characters will sort of come into it, but it's much more manageable. It's much closer to what an audience expects in terms of a core cast. And that is easier to handle. However, this is one of the most complicated ways to, or maybe not complicated, but difficult ways to alter narrative structure, because now you're trying to create links between a lot of events where there's potentially an expectation that they were going to happen in an entirely different way. If someone took the Hundred Years' War and decided they were going to show it as if it only happened over 5 years, there are a lot of events there, a lot of battles that suddenly you would have hot on the heels of each other. There would be changes in power structures and changes in power relationships within the various factions that suddenly you don't have an easy answer for how they came about. So you have to think of a way around that, or a different way to construct them. And so there's a lot more heavy lifting going on in the background in the narrative when you compress time this way than simply having a time jump to skip over the boring bits. But in practical terms, if it is a large enough amount of time, which in Rings of Parts, thousands of years, that makes significantly more sense than doing time jumps, because time jumps would have ended up with entire characters appearing and disappearing so quickly through the series that the only ones that an audience would end up identifying with would be the elves. And you would wonder, why would you even bother telling the story? So you can see why it's done that way. So this was just a discussion of some of the different ways that what we assume is very simple when it comes to storytelling, that you have a chronological sequence of events, that lots of storytelling complicates that, lots of storytelling plays with it, and they play with it in different ways. And it's not that any one way is the right way to do it. There are different ways that would work better or worse for the actual narrative that you are creating. And it all is dependent on the narrative type and what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Time skips when you have hundreds or thousands of years, that's going to create enormous practical problems, like enormous practical problems, so much so that you would go, that's not feasible. Can you do it in flashback? Well, you could, except then you're still going to have the practical issues with human characters aging out every other episode or every episode. So that's not a solution. Can you divide it up into the different time periods? And that's one way to do it. Rings of Power could have shown these are the events happening at one time, and then concurrently shown it happening, different events happening at a later time, and done something closer to The Witcher. Although we saw that not everyone enjoyed Witcher Season 1 being done that way, which is why Witcher Season 2 is a simple chronology. So you could see that would be a different way that Rings of Power could have done it. What they chose to do with the conflation of events seems like the most logical solution to telling a story over that grand sweep of time that takes into account practical considerations of actors aging in and out, but also characters aging in and out. House of the Dragon, because of its focus on a single sort of lineage and fight that way, that there are a limited number of locations. And when we're talking about time jumps, we're not talking about time jumps that are well past the length of an ordinary human life. We're talking in terms of a couple of months, a couple of years, a decade, things that are manageable, things that can happen within a human time frame, not 200 years and expect the audience to pick up as if, oh yeah, we're still invested in this, even though it's brand new characters. So you can see time skipping in that sense works actually quite well, but special attention had to be paid to reintroducing the character now that they are played by a different actor. With the Serpent Queen, that framing device has been incredibly useful in creating this is what happened, this is where we are now, and doing that sort of the different parallels and how we ended up in this position. So there are two sort of stories advancing, and we know eventually they will meet up. And also it adds in that level of ambiguity that the writers can play with if they want to. They don't have to. They can have Catherine telling the story straight, but it allows that tool to be there at their disposal should they so wish. And the great thing about that for that story is it's two simple time periods, and you can skip as much as you want in the earlier time period. That can have lots of time skips in it because we've established the dominant current time with Samantha Morton playing Catherine de' Medici. That is the current time. Everything else can be fragmentary because she's telling the story, much in the same way that Connor McLeod remembering the highlights of his past or the lowlights, some of them were tragic. They didn't have to be lined up sequentially and chronologically and run one into the next. They could jump forward 10 years, 50 years, 100 years. That didn't matter because we'd established the current timeline. So, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.